Well, hey guys, welcome back to another Kicking Out with the Red Shadow, and it's kind of surprising. I'm making another video in this series so soon after the last one, but wrestling has kind of been on my mind here a little bit due to some things that have been going on, including the talk from the last video about CM Punk and Sting and all that. But this time around, I'm not really going to talk about current stuff. I want to talk about my favorite wrestlers, pretty much going back from my childhood up to today. So, I guess just kind of talk a little bit about my time as a fan of professional wrestling. I would say probably somewhere around 1985, 1986 is when I first, as probably a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, caught wind of this wrestling thing. Now, back in those days, a company like the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, was still, glitzy and over the top and outrageous and crazy characters, and just now that I look back on it, they just insulted the brain power of the average fan of that time with some of the crazy shit that they put out there. But God, for a kid at that time, it was just mesmerizing. These crazy, bigger-than-life characters, they were just, like I said, they were over the top, and you just couldn't help. You were either going to look at it and think, that's stupid as heck, and I don't want to watch it, or you were probably going to be on the edge of your seat watching every match, every interview, everything you could think of. And that's the way that I was. I first watched some of the mid-'80s WWF shows. I was aware in the mid to late 80s of WCW, or at least what would become WCW, that was back then was just the NWA. And I knew of guys like Sting and Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen and all that, but my loyalties and my interests were always going to lie in the WWF. And I think I didn't really have a specific favorite star back then, but I liked guys like Macho Man, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Junkyard Dog was awesome, Coco Beware, Andre the Giant. I mean, of course, who could forget Andre? I liked Hogan, but I wasn't like, just a Hulkamaniac. I wasn't wearing the red and the yellow. It was awesome when he, did the body slam on Andre the Giant, but I really liked a lot of different characters. Jake the Snake Roberts comes to mind. I always loved seeing him when he would wrestle, bringing out the python. He had a python, right? Yeah, I think so. But it was just sort of a general interest in wrestling. Just everything. I would gobble up every little match. It was probably not until sometime in the early 90s before I ever really latched onto specific wrestlers that I really enjoyed. And I would say it was probably at the end of the 80s where I fell out of interest with wrestling. I stopped watching it. I didn't pay that much attention to it. By the time that I got back to it in the early to mid-90s, guys like Hogan and Macho Man had jumped ship or were no longer really on TV. You had guys like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels who were, blossoming as single stars. I remember guys like Yokozuna. I remember when Lex Luger was in the WWF. I didn't pay much attention to him when he came over, but I remember the body slam challenge that he had with Yokozuna, kind of trying to mirror, Hogan and Andre. But it was sometime in the early to mid-90s when two particular characters, but one of them, or two characters, and one of them in particular that I really jumped onto, like my first favorite wrestler. And that was a guy by the name of Razor Ramon. The other guy was Diesel. And I liked them both, but Razor was like my favorite. There was just something about his machismo and his little toothpick flick at the camera. He was a guy who was a heel at times and was presented that way, but he was also, in my opinion, one of the first like anti-hero guys. Even before Stone Cold came along, he was a guy who was supposed to be bad, but people would cheer for him and wanted to see him. And I really, really, really enjoyed Razor Ramon for kind of that reason. It was like, I know I shouldn't like this guy, but he's just kind of cocky. He's just kind of arrogant enough. In the 90s, of course, by that point, in the 90s, I was already, in 1994, I would have been 20. So it was just a perfect time for me. It was like flaunting, arrogance against authority. I was no longer living under my dad's roof. I could just live on my own and feel how I wanted to feel. A wrestler who kind of exuded that was just perfect. So Razor Ramon was definitely my first favorite wrestler. But I didn't watch things on a constant basis back then. So I can't be like, oh yeah, that amazing match that he had against this person at that pay-per-view or on this episode of Raw. Raw was in its fledgling time back then. Pay-per-views were not something that this guy was going to be spending a lot of money on. Not for another good 4 or 5 years would I start actually spending money on pay-per-views. And I didn't always have access to cable. So I knew who the guy was. I liked his shtick. And like I said, Diesel as well, who started off as like a bodyguard for Shawn Michaels in WWF. I know that Kevin Nash had other characters in other organizations and whatnot, but Diesel was who I got to know him as. Scott Hall, I got to know him as Razor Ramon. A few years later, they would part ways with the WWF, and they would go to WCW and just wrestle under those names, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Who'd become the Outsiders, who eventually would be joined by Hogan, who was over there at that time, to create the New World Order, which was its own phenomenon. But as I said before, WCW was never my favorite company. It was always WWF. So despite the fact that they were over there having this, immensely popular phenomenon, my only interest in them was the fact that I liked them in WWF, and I wanted to know what was going on with them. I wanted them to come back to the WWF and, and reprise their roles as Ramon and Diesel, or just be there. Of course, later on they would, but it was never as good as it was the first time. But anyway, Razor Ramon was my first favorite wrestler. Now, after they had moved to WCW, and in some ways, I think kind of because of that, because those guys went over there and had popularity in their gimmick as the Outsiders, and then eventually the NWO. WCW started to win the Monday Night Wars. They would have the better ratings. Vince and the WWF had to try to keep up, and they started to debut the beginnings of the Attitude Era. You had stuff like Stone Cold who came along, eventually The Rock and his Attitude. D-Generation X was in there. Undertaker had an amazing character reinvention. That whole Ministry of Darkness Undertaker was amazing. I've always loved the Undertaker. I've always loved Stone Cold and The Rock. I consider those guys to be favorite wrestlers, but not at the level of something like Razor Ramon. And the next two favorite wrestlers, because they kind of debuted around the same time, and they were kind of in my consciousness at the same time. And that was Kane and Edge, who was originally a part of the Brood. I'll talk about Edge first. Edge debuted as a singles competitor. He had sort of almost sort of like a electronica sounding theme song, and they just made him out as he was this elusive guy. At first, he really felt like he had no personality. He wore sunglasses, he came in through the crowd, he had long blonde hair, wore sort of like a trench coat style thing, and it had colorful tights, full pant style tights, and he sort of had a intensity to him, but in the beginning he didn't really talk, so there was no personality. There was no way to gauge how he was, who he was. Kane was a character who had no voice really in the beginning. I just liked him because he was big and badass, and he was red, and red's my favorite color. Actually, red and black, that color scheme is my favorite. Kane just fit the bill. He was awesome. He was sort of like this flip side to The Undertaker, and I like the dynamic of the two of them together. That's really all that there needs to be said about my reasons for liking Kane, especially back in the beginning days. But Edge was more of a work in progress. Eventually, they debuted this other blonde-haired guy who started messing with Edge in his matches, a guy by the name of Christian, who was also eventually involved with this other blonde-haired, gothic-looking guy named Gangrel, who kind of had a vampire-ish gimmick going. But eventually, the three of them paired together and made a stable called The Brood, it's always been my favorite stable ever in wrestling. You can have your DXs, you can have your Four Horsemen, you can have your NWOs. The Brood was it for me. They were just really cool. Once again, another edgy attitude type thing at the right time in the business. I just loved it. And I always wanted to see Kane join the Brood. And I also always wanted to see a character of my own creation who was going to be called The Shadow. And he was going to look a lot like Edge and Christian, only he was going to have, his blonde hair was going to be long, but it was going to be colored red. And he was going to be another one who wasn't really going to do a lot of talking. I kind of wanted him to have the some of the characteristics of like Sting, up in the rafters, always watching, never really getting involved, just kind of creepy from afar. Anyway, that character in my my SmackDown games eventually became the Red Shadow. That's how I got the name, was because of this idea I had for a character for the Brood. Eventually, Edge and Christian, just to kind of condense this a little bit, Edge and Christian split off from the Brood. Gangrel went away. Edge and Christian were a popular tag team for a while, and then singles competitors. Edge became the champion several times. Had probably, well, I think he was the first character to use his Money in the Bank championship contract to win the title. It was just at one of those points in Edge's character where he was kind of devious and a bit of a heel, but it was perfect. I enjoyed it. I really, really liked it. And I really liked Edge all the way up until he had to retire due to injuries. But those days with the Brood in those first few years were my favorite. Edge was up there. And like I said, Kane was up there too. Kane's character has been through the ringer over the years, and I feel bad because honestly the guy deserves a little bit more than what he's gotten. In terms of a fair shake by the company. But he's a good company man, and that's good. I'm sure he's made a good living off of it, but he needed a dominant championship run as Kane. That's my opinion. He should have had that. I think before I jump into something next, I'm going to wrap this up, keep this to maybe like a two-part thing instead of a long video. So come back for part 2. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in that next one.